For me, travel is the best teacher, sometimes even more than books.
You sense a place with all your senses, from taste to sight to sound. So I think it's so important to be able to travel.
The more you travel, the more landscapes that you come across. Those are the landscapes which become the defining factor of what you work.
To learn in a week by traveling is more than what you learn in an entire semester of an MBA program.
Physical traveling from one place or through the pages or through planes and plane windows matters.
We're delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol. It's a pleasure to present today Monuments Matter. Nayanjot Lahiri, Naman Ahuja and Jyotindra Jain in conversation with Rana Safvi. This session is in partnership with Air Asia. The human species responds to the passage of time by building monuments, structures vested with power, memory, meaning, sites where the past continues to live. In Monuments Matter, India's archaeological heritage since independence, historian Nayanjot Lahiri examines and celebrates the country's ancient history, guiding the reader through the changing frontiers of prehistoric India, discussing the impact that the partition had on monuments, touching on matters of conservation, upkeep and contentious disputes. Lahiri is a professor of history at Ashoka University. Her other books include Archaeology and the Public Purpose, writings on and by M.N. Deshpande and Ashoka in Ancient India. Naman Ahuja is an art historian and curator. His books include Art and Archaeology of Ancient India, Earliest Times to the 6th Century and the Body in India, Art and Thought. Jyotindra Jain, formerly professor of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU, is an art historian who is presently engaged in research on colonial practices of collecting art from Indian monuments and the provenance of Indian art objects in foreign museums. In conversation with Rana Safvi, Ahuja Jain and Lahiri discussed the history and methodology of archaeological research in India, the roles played by government institutions, including the Archaeological Survey of India, in protecting built heritage and the cultural legacy of monuments. Nayanjot Lahiri is a professor of history at Ashoka University. The recipient of 2013 Infosys Prize in Humanities, she is the author of many books including Monuments Matter, India's Archaeological Heritage since Independence. Her most recent book is Archaeology and the Public Purpose, writing on and by M.N. Deshpande. Naman P. Ahuja is a curator and professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His studies on Indian art have explored the aesthetics of Indian visual culture, iconography and transculturalism in antiquity, as well as the legacy of the arts and crafts movement in modern period. Apart from various research papers, he is the author of the following books: Divine Presence, The Art of India and the Himalayas, The Making of Modern Indian Artist Craftsmen, Devi Prasad, The Body in Art and Thought, The Arts and Interiors of Rashtrapati Bhavan, Lutens and Beyond, India and the World, A History in the 9 Stories, and most recently, The Art and Archaeology of Ancient India, Oxford Ashmolean Museum, November 2018. Jyotindra Jain, formerly director of the National Crafts Museum and professor of Arts and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, has been a visiting professor at Harvard and Humboldt University, Berlin. A scholar of Indian art and fellow of the Asiatic Society of Bombay, Jain is a recipient of Prince Claus Award and Cross of the Order of Merit of Germany. Rana Safvi is a passionate believer in India's Ganga Jamuni's Tehzeeb, which she documents through her writings, podcasts and videos. In 2011, she started the Twitter forum Shair, which was responsible for popularizing Urdu online. It's a unique platform which is still going strong with over 20,000 members. She has published 7 books so far on culture, history and monuments of India. These are tales from the Quran and Hadith. The Delhi Trilogy, Where Stone Speaks, The Forgotten Cities of Delhi and Shahjahanabad, The Living City of Old Delhi. She has translated both the editions of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's seminal work on Delhi, Asar-as-Sanadid, Dastane-Ghadar and 4 accounts of 19th and 20th century Delhi from Urdu to English. She is also a regular contributor to various national newspapers and magazines. Her blog, ranasafvi.com, is a repository of cultural, literary and historical heritage. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section on your screens. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Monuments Matter, Nayanjot Lahiri, Naman Ahuja and Jyotindra Jain in conversation with Rana Safvi. Enjoy the session.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be in conversation today with 3 of India's leading historians, curators and museologists. Architecture, according to Ibn Khaldun, is one of the necessary crafts. This is the first and oldest craft of sedentary civilization. While epigraphy, excavation, and setting up site museums were part of Archaeological Survey of India activities from the beginning, the periodic conservation of monuments and sites was taken up only after 1940s. archaeology in India has progressively changed from an antiquarian pursuit to rigorous science, and that is what we will be discussing today. So I would like to start first with the history and methodology of archaeological research in India, and I come to you, Professor Nayanjot Lahiri. Your wonderful book, Monuments Matter, India's Archaeological Heritage Since Independence, is a very detailed work. Can you take us through the history and methodology of archaeological research in India, especially with the division of the artifacts during 1957 when India was partitioned?
Thank you, Rana. It's a pleasure to be here today. Jyotindra Jain and Naman Ahuja were the editors of MARG when this volume, Monuments Matter, was published. And Rana actually reviewed it. So it's just wonderful that we are all together on this panel. What I mentioned in that book, and I think that is worth reiterating, is that the cumulative research post-independence is very impressive, even though there are huge challenges. Challenges which are very annoying because they're so easy to address, and they would make all the difference to the discipline. But let me begin by just mentioning a few landmarks. So I think the discovery of the Harappan civilization in India is a major success story. Prior to independence, you had less than half a dozen sites that you could think of in India, and you certainly couldn't think of any cities. But today you can think not just of a Kalibangan in Rajasthan, but also Rakhigadi in Haryana and Dholavira in Gujarat. There's also no more any kind of dark age in the long millennia that separates the end of the Harappan civilization and the birth of historical cities. And the credit for that actually goes to a lot of the universities in India, especially the Deccan College Pune and the MS University at Baroda, which have helped in build up an entire timetable of cultures across India, I think, with the exception of the Northeast. Third, I think there have been some very dramatic prehistoric discoveries. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the fact that we know of hominins more than 1.5 million years ago living in Tamil Nadu at Athirambakkam. And also the rock art of advanced hunter-gatherers, especially in Madhya Pradesh. And, when we look at prehistory, one of the things which strikes me is the strong understanding that there is a connected history beyond the subcontinent that actually impacts it. So to just give one example, when you think of the big super eruption of the Toba volcano in Indonesia, we know that it deposited ash in Andhra and Maharashtra, and that adversely impacted prehistoric people. But I think alongside these landmark, discoveries, we should be aware of the challenges. Unlike many other nations, China, for instance, we haven't invested seriously in archaeological science. So if you look at the small print in articles, you realize that most of the biological samples or the scientific dating is done outside India. So we haven't actually seriously built up the skill sets of our institutions and our scholars. And it's a great pity in a country which has such a rich and diverse treasure of archaeological riches. Secondly, we haven't also published adequately our most important work in a manner in which it would give India a place on the high table of world archaeological research. So the Dholavira excavation report, for all the uniqueness of the city, has not been published. And finally, I do want to mention that our archaeological inheritance may have grown since independence, but our monuments, our relics, our sculpture continue to remain very vulnerable and compromised. So there's no point in pious posturing about its beauty and greatness if ownership for its survival is not actually treated as a matter of national priority.
I so agree with this. I have just visited Faizabad yesterday, and to see the monuments, which was once the seat of the capital of the Nawabs of Awadh, and to see the monuments crumbling in front of our eyes, it was very, very, depressing. And I agree with exactly what you said. Coming to Professor Naman Ahuja, in your book, Indian Architecture and Sculpture, from the 5th to the 14th century, you write in the overview, many types of religious and secular architecture have been made in the history of India. Each has influenced the other, and strictly speaking, if anyone wishes to study them properly, no one type can be studied without knowledge of the other. You use Professor Ramla Thapar's phrase, tyranny of labels. Why do you think that it is important to study the cross-cultural architectural influences? Can you elaborate on this for students and researchers of archaeology, please?
Thanks, yes. The tyranny of labels. I think, well, before I come to that, I just want to say, I think what Nayanjot just said was so succinct and so perfectly articulate as a real issue that we are dealing with, as an overview of the problem where substantial bodies of research have not really come out into the public domain, and we're not on the high table of world archaeology for want of actually having a certain kind of public participation and a commitment on the part of the archaeologists and the publishers to be able to disseminate the kind of information, to give it the kind of editorial attention that archaeology really warrants. I don't think there are very many countries that are quite as rich as South Asia, which have such a poor track record of their of making archaeology readable and accessible, having even establishing a peer review process within South Asia for archaeology is really not easy because the specialists are actually dwindling, I think, in our country. But that apart, back to your question about the tyranny of labels, which is, I think, also another excellent phrase that I tried to bring attention to in my own research papers, where I feel that we've been limited in our thinking about a particular period or way of thinking about Indian history because we just can't seem to break away from the categories that material has been put into. A common example of this is that when we teach Indian art, it is still studied as examples of the visual illustrations of Hinduism or the visual illustration of Buddhist religion or Islam or Jainism. And that reinforces the religious or communal divides that exist in our society. I actually think that the art of each period does much more than simply tell us about religion. I'm not denying that a lot of art is concerned with religion, and certainly it is very rich and beautiful, and it deserves to be understood in light of what it can illuminate about the history of that religion. But we can't just use all that art only for a telling of history of India's religion. And instead, we should also be using it to tell us about so many other processes or for other purposes that it existed for. Now, I should clarify that Indian art and Indian architecture and sculpture from the 5th to 14th century was not a book that I wrote. It was actually a section of a book that I wrote for the NCERT class 11 and 12 textbooks on art history. And I chose to call that part of the book, name it after the art of a period, even though they had originally invited me to write about Hindu art. Instead, I said that, can I rephrase it and call it art from the 5th to the 14th centuries instead, please? And that's what I mean, just trying to make a little intervention and a small shift. If I had stuck to that brief, I could have done little else with my material than to use it to illuminate a history of Hinduism that might have further forced me to talk about or explain the art through one particular dominant form of Hinduism. Not even, but by titling it 5th to 14th centuries, I was able to open up the question that not only was Hinduism much more plural and varied, but that there were also many other things taking place in the country at the same time. And in that NCERT book, for instance, I tried to see how Buddhists and Jains also built temples and how you can't study their expressions without knowing about the developments that were happening in the same period in Hindu ones, or how the iconography of the deities of one sect was influencing the creation of new deities in another sect. Hindu temples in Gujarat, Rajasthan, and even Banaras began to incorporate many designs of arches and domes, which are normally characteristic of Islamic art that came into Hindu temples after the 12th century. So by just having a date pattern, and then it allowed me as an editor and as a writer to be able to bring in multiple things that happened in that period. So these issues have been talked about, I think, in a variety of other research papers as well, where we can bring in other kinds, use the art from this period to talk about histories of trade and migration, or gendered violence, if you want to, or transculturalism. These can be the sort of many other ways in which we can break away from the tyranny of labels and open up the discourse to seeing how monuments and art objects matter in a variety of ways.
So well put, that art tells us much more than just about religion. And it's about the era and not about just a particular religion. Thank you. Professor Jyotinder Jain, coming to you. Many of our monuments are lavishly decorated with paintings and sculptures. What does that tell us about the era, and what information do they give to the researchers?
Rana, before I come to your question, I also would like to make two points. One is regarding Nayan Jot, that after the main Indus Valley sites went to Pakistan, and immediately after independence, I think there was a huge kind of in Dr. Sankalia and before and around in Deccan College, and a lot of work being done, and which expanded our knowledge about Indus Valley civilization and its spread, which I think all post-independence. I would be revisiting the colonial period with regard to your question, and also later on colonial period dealing with monuments and what happened, disasters that were done to the monuments, and restoration. We were left to only chemical and things like that. We were taught, but we were never told that what has been removed from our monuments, whether that can also be restored. It's easily possible, and I'll give an example. Now, Rana, your question has two parts. One is sculptures, paintings, etc., as a kind of decoration on the monuments, and second part is what do they offer to researchers. Now, first part first, the sculptures and etc. which are on the temple, they were treated entire colonial period from the angle of decoration. You know, that is got inside us, that everything that was on the surface, and if you read Indian art history of that period, they constantly use the word embellishment, adornment, as if these were decorative. And decorative embellishment, that also then tells us that as if these were kind of secular, they were kind of design. And along with that comes this, the whole colonial idea of the dichotomy of the sacred and the profane, as if there was a very clear, sharp dividing line between between profane and sacred. So I feel that the sculptures, particularly which are on outer walls of the temples and which have been hugely plundered and lying elsewhere, partly because they were treated in the colonial period as if secondary, as if not really essential to the whole temple, and therefore they could be taken. You know, they were kind of designed. You know, so I feel that that issue needs to be discussed. And you know, if you take the Sanskrit word, for example, alankar. Now, alam, the word alam means extra, something which is secondary, something which is added on. And therefore, alankar also means jewelry. The word alankar is used, meaning it's not a part of the body, naman, body in Indian art, but not, you know, that is something additional. So as these were treated like that, and they were taken away, broken, whatever. So, you know, this I think was a very important aspect about treating them colonial thing of as if they were added and additional. Entire stupas, temple, etc. They were one unified whole, and they were consecrated. And when people not only worshipped in the sanctum sanctorum, but also they did pradakshina, or they went around, they circumambulated. When they circumambulated, they also worshipped those sculptures, etc., which the colonial scholars described as added on or decorative. So this becomes very structural part of so these comprised of directional deities, apsaras, yakshis, matrikas, mother goddesses, planets personified as anthropomorphic forms, other deities, yoginis. These were all, so they were not decorative as such, you know, and these were all objects of worship. The second part of your question, just briefly in 2 sentences, I answer. You said, what do they offer to study? And there I come to what Naman said earlier, that you know, when we visit, let's take Hindu temple, because these were into inverted commas decorated with sculptures. So you go to southern India, go to eastern India, different parts of country, Shiva, Vishnu, might be some of the goddesses are common, but iconographies vary, regional Hindu. So you are asking me, what do they offer to us? You know, they offer to us a regional view of Hinduism rather than offering us a view of monolithic Hinduism, a kind of canonical Hinduism, which today particularly is being treated as if the essence of Hinduism, and that Hinduism was so limited and that it was monolithic and it was dogmatic. It's not so. The regional practices, even regional canons, if you look at South Indian Shilpa Shastras and all, you find that they are, you know, so this is what it offers to scholars. Of course, not only chronicling iconography, but to look at the regional, and then we understand that Hinduism was much broader religion, much more open, much more, you know, and this is what an angle that we now in post-colonial India and rather late, we need to start looking at this religious, social, political angle to looking at our monuments.
Thank you for this detailed answer and very, very insightful take on what the iconography offers to us, especially in today's world. So to come to the next part segment, museums have played an integral role in preserving the history of our society. The exhibits tell us stories about how our nation, our communities, and our cultures came to be, and without them, those stories could be forgotten. The importance of museums in building a culture of inquiry and knowledge amongst the public, in particular children, is now being explored, and it's a very important aspect. Here I'd like to start with you, Professor Jain. You are currently engaged in research on colonial practices of collecting art from Indian monument and the provenance of Indian art objects in foreign museums. What is our obligation to truth? And what is in your view, is the importance of provenance, and why do you think it is increasingly being recognized as an independent academic discipline? Do you think there should be close partnership with the post-colonial societies whose objects the museums are aspiring to conduct the said research on?
Yeah, right from my PhD students' days, I've been traveling abroad and visiting museums in Europe and America, and when I see the kind of wealth of Indian objects that they are displayed all over, that does make me feel, where do they come from? You know, they are not isolated objects or things that one can buy in a market. They come from monuments, and monuments were public property. And it wasn't easy that one could just sell them or produce a document or a bill to show that we have acquired it legitimately or things like that. All this sort of led me to think, but today, a few things have happened in the last 3-4 years all over Europe, and an extremely important debate is raging all over Europe and America, about which India is completely sleepy, and that is the whole question of provenance research, and also research about, or not research, but issue of restoration of these objects which are lying elsewhere. Restitution issue, you know. So your question, Rana, has again 3 parts. What is, in my view, the importance of provenance and provenance research, which in India has very, I'll come to that. Second part of yours is independent, whether there is a possibility of having an provenance research, etc., as a independent academic discipline. Yes, and I will briefly later on summarize what can be the syllabus for that. And third is close partnership with the post-colonial societies in order to achieve that. Now coming to your first part, that provenance, what is provenance? Some of the viewers may not know, because a little bit of technique. Formerly, provenance was like, you know, you filled up in a catalog, name of the object, period, provenance. Provenance will say Mathura or Gwalior or whatever. So that was limited to place of origin. But today the word provenance and provenance research, particularly under the ethical awareness that is coming, actually not coming, but somehow at least lip service is being paid abroad to the ethics of collecting and possessing object. So in that I find that how an object traveled from a monument or from a place of its origin to European or American museums. And this process, you know, is very, very important, because we are told continuously that there is a whole idea of universal museum, we are protecting, we have looked after, and then many countries have laws that say that an object is lying with us for 10 years, it becomes a part of our property, lots and lots of these things. So I think provenance research, so particularly something that was taken in colonial period. Then of course there were wartime plunders, you know, and then there was smuggling, etc. So there were 3 ways in which objects reached abroad. Now these were all basically looted. Now most noteworthy examples, because there are hundreds and hundreds, but I'll take 2 examples which made the issue of provenance and restoration or restitution a kind of brought it into world focus. One is the very famous case of the Elgin marbles, which were taken from Parthenon and Acropolis in 1801 by Lord Elgin, and nearly 50% of this Greek treasure was looted and brought abroad and displayed, and later on sold to the British government and then transferred to British Museum. That had created a lot of, this issue came into prominence due to that case of these marbles, which are still there and never returned, though there is a lot of hue and cry world over. But very recently, in last 2 years, another thing that has happened, and about which I think in India there is hardly any awareness, but it has startled the Western museum world, and that is a speech that was given by the French President Emmanuel Macron in Burkina Faso in November this year, November 2017, just two and a half years ago. And Macron said in that speech that colonialism is a crime against humanity. And he said colonialism is barbarism. And then he promised that he would try and return the objects of particularly Africa, because the French had African colonies, and said we would try and return all these plundered objects and things like that. So he commissioned a report on these African things which are lying there, and he said, now imagine that 5 lakh African objects are in Europe and only 3,000 of inferior quality are in Africa. Let's talk about India. What's happening? Indian examples, say best of Mughal manuscripts are abroad, undoubtedly. And I'm making a qualified statement that best of our Mughal manuscripts are abroad. Some of the best sculptures coming from temple walls, etc., are abroad. Entire stupa of Amravati with 120 panels and sculpture are abroad, and despite some little noise that we occasionally made, we never did anything to whereas African countries, many other in Egypt and all, there's so much noise. Sitting here in Europe, I know every day there's something in newspaper about restitution of these objects. We haven't done, and therefore I feel that there is a need for us to have some kind of central institute or something for provenance research and ideas of restoration, legalities, etc. and things. So also, Naman, you showed this Malli here. Are you also going to tell me where is the head? So there was a huge head hunting. So all the heads are lying in Europe and America, and all the torsos are lying in India. There was a wonderful research done with regard to Angkor Wat, and a book had come out published by ICOM, where they had tried to connect Angkor heads lying in Europe and the bodies lying elsewhere. So I think there's a possibility. And if you go to a monument and you just see so many sculptures, art historically, using art historical method, every object, almost every sculpture lying abroad, you can identify from stylistic study that where does this come from? And if not, is it not possible for us to even begin making a kind of appeal with regard to the, we don't forget anything, can't we even have a survey of the thing? So, and then your second part, to come quickly, I'll take 1 more minute, is the, if we do Provenance Research Institute, what do we do? For example, why should we, and what would it do? For example, theories of colonialism, post-colonialism, Orientalism, slavery, these are things that have formed the background of colonial plunder. Secondly, we can compile at least an inventory. Demand comes afterward, but we have no inventory of what is lying abroad. So that, and from which monument, etc. Then art historical research on them. Then there is a study of trajectory of the, how did they go abroad? It can't be that, they always tell us, produce a proof. Now, it can't be that the accused, the judge and the jury, they are all they themselves. And they don't listen to. What more do you need ethically to say that this comes from here? There are empty niches and there are offcuts lying of sculptures and things like that. Can't we do anything about this? So that is the second and third part of your question. I stop here. I've taken a lot of time.
We need a session just on this. We are running a little short of time, but Professor Naman, I would like to talk to you about the plurality of approaches to the body on Indian monuments, which you've talked about in your book, The Body in Indian Art and Thought. If you could just quickly go through this question. Can we have the slide, please?
Yes. Well, I think Jyotendra raised this point about provenance studies, and he asked specifically, like with regard to this sculpture that I wanted to share with everyone, where could the head possibly be? And I think when you open up research, there are many plausible answers to that question. And indeed, headhunting has gone on, and decapitation has gone on at many points, either for the sake of getting a trophy or for the sake of getting an object that you want to put in your collection, in your museum, like a headhunter. Most often in South Asia, we tend to have a narrative where the decapitation took place because of Islamic iconoclasm. And there is a belief that most statues were decapitated because they would have the worship of idols was not considered appropriate. It could be, however, just as that complicates the picture and we cannot rest the despoliation and the wreckage of heritage on the door of the colonial masters only, we can also not rest it entirely on the foot of and say that these are all victims of jihad. There have been as many claimants and sources of despoliation and desecration even within traditions. And the more we deepen our research, we find more and more plausible causative agents for when that wreckage of the body could have taken place. Now, one of my pleas has been in museum displays as a curator. I think what your fundamental question, museums have a very important role to play indeed. They can tell us rich and important histories because they can appeal to all our sense perceptions. They don't have to just be the written word. You can watch films, you can listen to music, you can hear stories, you can see artifacts, you can see the evidence for yourself. And this original source material is something that the public needs to become aware of. What do we as historians or art historians do when we encounter original source material? Indeed, it can be interpreted in many ways. The headhunting colonial collector who wanted it for his museum is as important and valid a narrative to put to the public as the narrative of the possibility of having lost this body's head to a jihad. It is as important to be able to also tell the story that what was really going on in the Jain tradition in about the 10th, 11th centuries when it suddenly became the gender of the Jain Tirthankar Malli in the scriptures was changed. The oldest Jain texts refer to Mallinath as a female. And after about between the 7th and 11th centuries, the texts start referring to Mallinath as a male figure. A parallel view grew in Jainism, which considered nudity inappropriate for women, but nudity was essential for a Tirthankar. Now, the other thing that happens is, therefore, woman cannot be Tirthankar. The other thing that happens is that moksha was something that you can get when you are a very good man, but as a woman, you do not have direct access to achieving moksha in this lifetime. The best a woman could achieve was to be reborn as a man, and then once she comes back as a man, in that janam, she can aspire to becoming a Tirthankar or having moksha or whatever. Now, to achieve something. Now, if those are if that is the nature of gendered violence that is taking place in that society, one can easily imagine that a nude figure of a woman sitting in Dhyanasan with one plait falling down her back in this beautiful sculpture, one jasmine flower placed in her palm. I mean, it's a really exquisite sculpture. But somebody in Unnao, where this sculpture came from, and Unnao we know has a long history of gendered violence. It continues to have problems with gendered violence in the news even these days. I mean, even then it could be a Jain community that had a problem with this sculpture, just as much as it could have been suffered at the hands of any other community. So what I'm trying to argue for is that telling those multiple histories of violence, of the battering that bodies have been through, is extremely important. And I talk about it in this essay called Conflict. Can museums tell us why? What role do museums play in society, in informing us about the conflicts that exist in our society? Could you show me the next slide? And I'll just make a point briefly with another sculpture. You see, in this piece, a beautiful Surasundari that we put on the cover of the Body in Indian Art and Thought that comes from Khajuraho. Now, if you look at this sculpture became so famous that they made postage stamps out of her in the 1970s. And the reason was because they wanted to show that this was an example of female empowerment. And this was a literate woman from ancient times from ancient India. You can see her writing. That was so important, that female literacy was there in ancient India. Sure, it was. But a close examination of her body also reveals that she has nail marks on her body. I don't know if you can see just next to her armpit, there are lots of marks. Now, similarly, if you look on her shoulders and around her neck, there are these similar crescent-shaped marks that are there in many parts of her back. And the bruising is prompting her to smile and write, releasing the poet in her. Now, this is quite interesting. This bruising is, of course, the marks left by her lover who held her, right? And this is, so, but then there is another question. There might be these nail marks on this body, but this sculpture was never displayed in a museum at eye level. This was 20 feet high up on the walls of the temples of Khajuraho. So the question then to be asked is, who are these nail marks for? Who saw these nail marks, right? Why were they even there on this sculpture? Now, the artist must have thought that it was necessary to make these marks on her body because he wishes to, it's part of what makes this sculpture complete. It was part of the iconography of the training of the artist to use these kinds of little marks to make the sculpture look complete. To him, it was complete, even if the public never saw it. And that takes you into a way of thinking about ancient art. And that means that when we are looking at this material, how are we going to teach all this if we only had classes on Hindu art? Or if we only had classes on Buddhist art? You're only going into the religious aspect of the art, but all of this rich kavya that lies alongside it is also another history that you can't tell, which the museum has a role to be able to do. So I think it poses fundamental questions. If you look at the entire form of the sculpture, the angle at which the base is cut, you realize that it was just tilting outward so that people would have seen it from down below. The museum has a role to play to be able to tell you how that monument was used, what meanings that monument had. It can be in a poetic context. It can be in a history of conflict. It can tell us multiple histories. And that takes us to a public appreciation of engaging with these monuments, engaging with the art, and learning much more about history than being sequestered into learning about it only through the narrow tyranny of our labels otherwise.
Rana, one can't hear you.
Sorry, I come to you, Professor Lahiri. In 1915, Indian archaeological policy, as stated by Howard Hargreaves, the DG of ASI, said that the emphasis should be put on on-site museums so that they may be studied amid the natural surroundings and not lose focus by being transported. How important do you think are on-site museums?
So let me give you a quick answer since, we are running out of time. I think on-site museums, remain as relevant and important as before. But with the caveat that these are not just for the safekeeping of excavated objects and fragments, in relation to the adjacent sites. I think there ought to be much more emphasis on museum design, so that they are interesting and engaging for visitors. And, you can do a lot of things, but one of the things that needs to be done is, and successful museums do that all the time, is that you need to build a story or stories around the displays. So for that, you need to use archival material, you need to use old photographs, travelogues, epigraphic records, and, just make it come alive. It's not just that there was this stuff which was lying on the site and it has been put in the site museum. And I think all that is used, copies at least of those, should be in a research desk or in the form of outreach, for students, because young kids really like to understand, how do you make the story? How do you create a story around an object? what have you used? What are the sources? And if you have a library and if you have a research desk, I think that would really, make site museums as a kind of link between research and education. So, I hope that there will also be alongside a kind of outreach. It shouldn't just be that people who come to site museums manage to see the objects. With the one good thing with the pandemic has been that there is much more, ease with just virtual trawling. And so, people should have access to virtual displays of what is in the museum and all the stories around them as well. So I think they remain very, very relevant even now. Can't hear you.
It's been such a privilege speaking to the three of you, and the points that all of you have made are very, very important. There's one question, and I think this is from Fatma. She asked, the cause for concern is, there's one question first by Sania, I think, and the other one is related. We see that preserving Islamic heritage is one of particular importance and concern right now. Do you think Islamic monuments are under threat? We have just 3 minutes, so if one of you could answer it quickly.
Well, very quickly, yes, I think they are there is a problem. I think when provenance history and research is going on, as Jyotindra very correctly pointed out, there was a massive exodus of Mughal libraries and Sultanate libraries. And these manuscripts were raided a very long time ago, not just during colonial times, but in pre-colonial times. We have histories where the raiding of libraries has actually gone on for many more hundreds of years. And remember, Nadir Shah took away the largest portion of the library of the Mughal library. So I think monuments and libraries and museums do go through threats at different points in history, and they remain vulnerable. At times of attack, in terms of insurgencies, all monuments are always under direct, under the attention of insurgents at all time. And with the rise of any insurgencies in the world, monuments will come under attack. We should take it as a given. So we need to have policies in place about what we are going to do for monument protection at a time when there are going to be greater amounts of insurgencies.
There's one more question. I think we have 1 minute. Divya asks, how would you classify the effect that the various governments of India have had on the preservation of these monuments in the Indian subcontinent?
So can I answer that very quickly? I think, for all the abuse that is hurled on Nehru, I think the Nehruvian era was very important in, in bringing in certain policies, including bringing in a regulated zone and a prohibited zone, around monuments. It was also Pandit Nehru who was quite upfront about the fact that while the Nagarjun Sagar was being built, Nagarjun Konda was being destroyed, but that at least parts of it could be transported out. You compare that to the situation in the last 15 years or 20 years, where you have large SEZs, these special economic zones being created or the metro being created, and there is actually no salvage archaeology that is done side by side. So if you were to ask me about, an era which was, I would say in some ways qualitatively different, I would say post-independence, it was the Nehruvian era.
Thank you so much. And I'm afraid we are out of time. This discussion could have gone on forever as far as I am concerned. Listening to the three of you has been a privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rana, Naman, and Nayanjot.
Thank you, Nayanjot Lahiri, Naman Ahuja, Jyotindra Jain, and Rana Safi for such an enlightening conversation. It was a delight to hear all of you. Thank you so much for being part of Jaipur Literature Festival 2021. We would like to thank AirAsia for presenting this session. We also like to thank our celebration partner, Diageo. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. You can also tweet using hashtag Jaipur at the Festival 2021 @JaipurLitFest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you next time. Thank you.
For me, travel is the best teacher, sometimes even more than books.
You sense a place with all your senses, from taste to sight to sound. So I think it's so important to be able to travel.
The more you travel, the more landscapes that you come across. Those are the landscapes which become the defining factor of what you work.
To learn in a week by traveling is more than what you learn in an entire semester of an MBA program.
Physical traveling from one place or through the pages or through planes and plane windows matters.